Hello, this is Teresa. Welcome back for another card tutorial. Today I'll be showing 3 different ways to use the Christmas Rose stamp set and dies from Dare to Be Artsy. I will be using partial die cutting as well as a traditional die cutting technique on all 3 cards. For my first card, I'm going to be using the large die in the Christmas Rose stamp set cluster, as well as the matching pattern paper. And as you can see from me putting the stamp directly on top of the pattern paper, there are some of the pattern or places on the pattern paper where it matches exactly to the stamp. I'm going to be cutting around one of those clusters because I'm going to die cut out that piece using the large die that comes in the matching die set to the Christmas Rose stamp set. And now you will see where I've already die cut that out of the pattern paper and I'm ready to move on to the next stage. I'm going to be gold heat embossing on top of this pattern paper, and so therefore I'm going to use the stamp that comes in this set. I'll line it up exactly over top of that pattern paper, and although you don't see it on the screen, I added or stamped on it with Versamark ink, added gold embossing powder, and now I'm heat setting that on the piece of pattern paper. Unfortunately, I did miss a few spots when my stamping. Probably wasn't careful enough when I stamped with the Versamark, but I have a embossing pen, so it puts down the same kind of ink that you'd get with Versamark, and I went over some of the lines that were missed before, and then I'll just heat emboss over that and get a better result. So that's one way to fix a little error like that if you're working on a card and you don't want to start over, and I certainly did not want to start over. So now I'm working with a strip of red cardstock, and it's cut to 2 inches by 5.5 inches wide. And I'm going to be using a piece of this Post-it labeling tape. Sorry for my head getting in the way. I'm going to create a gold strip across the top, and I'm using Versamark to add to stamp directly to that strip of paper on top, and I'm going to use the same gold embossing powder I used on the pattern paper earlier, and when I melt it, then I will have a matching gold strip across this piece of red cardstock, and that saves me from having to add another piece of cardstock. Plus it matches exactly to the gold embossing powder I used on the pattern paper. So I'm brushing off a few stray pieces of the gold embossing powder, and now I'm going to heat set that. So this is a great way to match all the elements in your project, like I'm doing today, as I'm using the same gold embossing powder throughout the project. Now the next thing I'm going to be doing is creating a pattern background for the top of the card base. And by the way, I am using a standard A2 size card. When folded, it measures 4¼ inches by 5.5 inches wide. So I'm adding my anti-static powder all over the surface of the card front, and I'm using Versamark again, and I'm using the small outline stamp from the Christmas Rose stamp set. And although you cannot see this on paper, even though my head's in the way, even if it weren't, you wouldn't be able to see where I'm stamping. But if you're doing this in real life, you can see where you've stamped onto the paper. So I'm just going to stamp the rose just enough times to make sure that by the time I get the red strip added onto the bottom, it's not going to look like I just suddenly stopped at that point as far as creating the pattern. So now you can see where I've stamped because I'm adding the gold embossing powder, and then the next step will be to heat set this. And now I'm going to show you how I use the Cheers die. Actually, I'm just using one of the 3 dies in this set. I'm using the word. This does come with an outline as well as a label for the background, so it's a really cool set if you want to use all 3 parts of it. Today I'm only going to be using the smaller part of the die, and I want to create another piece of paper that has gold embossing powder all over it. As you can see, I've already sprinkled it all over another piece of red cardstock, and the choice of cardstock is pretty arbitrary. It's just because I'm already working with it that I just went ahead and chose the red cardstock. And as you can see, I heated the bottom of the cardstock before turning it over and melting it from the top. At this point, I've already gone over to my die cut machine off camera and die cut the word out of that solid piece of embossed paper. It does take a little bit of time to get it out of the die, but it really wasn't too much of a problem as long as I didn't try to pull on it too hard. I ended up with a perfectly die cut sentiment to go on the front of the card. And you can see kind of roughly what the plan is for finishing it up. So I'm going to use some liquid glue to glue on the bottom red panel with the strip at the top side. And just to make sure that it lines up with the bottom, I just take a little care to move it around until it aligns perfectly. And now I'm using a Zig two-way pen to add some adhesive to the back of my die cut sentiment. And as you can see over there to the right, I've added some double-sided foam adhesive tape to the main die cut image that's going to go on the left-hand side of the card. So I'm using some tweezers just to help me with placement. Once I find the perfect place, I press it down in the center first and kind of work around to the edges before getting it completely adhered. And now that I've removed the backing paper, I find a good position for this so it doesn't cover up the die cut word. And with that, the only other step left is to trim off what's hanging off of the edge of the card. And my first card is complete. Now I'm going to take another A2 size card base that's already been pre-scored. I'm going to use Memento Black Tuxedo ink to stamp directly onto this Neenah Solar White cardstock because I'm going to be using doing Copic coloring on it. I don't actually show the coloring process today because I'm more focused on the technique I'm using here, which is a partial die cutting technique. So one of the key things is before beginning to die cut that you have the die aligned perfectly and taped down so that it does not shift during the process, because it can be really easy to miss that while you're running it through the die machine. And so I have a second piece of cardstock that I've cut to an A2 size front panel. The reason that I'm doing this is because I want to have a panel that can go behind the one on the front to hide the adhesive. And it may not make sense right now, but in a little bit I promise it will. So I haven't quite cut through either of the pieces of cardstock, so I'm putting this back in the die cut machine. And the way you do partial die cutting is to line up your plate, and I'll show a different way to do this than the way I did it this time that actually I think worked better than doing it this way. But what you see is because of where that plate is, the plate is, it only puts pressure to cut on part of the die cut, which is the whole thing behind partial die cutting. And now I've picked up the other piece of just plain white cardstock that I'm going to use later in the project. And like I said, it'll make more sense when I get to that point. I just wanted to make sure that it was die cut more or less at the same place in the cardstock as the colored panel. So now I'm lining up my T-square ruler, and I'm using a glass cutting mat underneath, by the way. It is my new Tonic glass mat from Ranger. I'm using this ruler to help me align where I want to cut from where the die cut left off to the edge of the paper. And one thing I did end up doing is going back later and trimming this further up than I did at this point. You're not going to see me actually go back and do this on camera, but later I will come back to do that because I noticed that it looked a little bit odd as far as how it cut out on one side versus the other. And so now I'm doing the same thing on my other panel, or the plain white panel. It's just cutting that. And if you run into trouble, you can always pick up your scissors and cut it, which is what I ended up doing because I was having some trouble for some reason getting this to go through the paper. Maybe I just wasn't pressing hard enough at the time. So now I'm going to adhere a piece of vellum. It is size 4¼ inches by 5½ inches wide to match the card size. And I'm using some of this double-sided adhesive tape on the inside of the front of the card panel. And I'm going to share a little tip with you as far as attaching vellum when you have a card that's die cut like this. It's a lot easier to get it aligned straight if you lay it down on the opposite side of the card, as you see me doing here. Now, it would have helped if I had kind of folded that card base a little bit more before I began, but I went back and folded it a little bit because I already had adhesive on the front. And now that it's aligned, I'm just going to fold over that top panel and press it down against the vellum, and voila, it is aligned perfectly. And now I'll reinforce my creased edge with a bone folder. Now the only thing left to complete this card at this point is to add not add a sentiment, but add the die cut on the inside to cover up where I had done my Copic coloring, because you can see it bled through a little bit. So that was the whole reason for creating this extra die cut piece. And now I'm adding liquid adhesive so that I have a little wiggle room to move it and get it aligned perfectly with the edge of the die cut on the outside so that it covers up both the adhesive as well as the bleed through from the coloring on the inside of the card. And now the only thing left will be to add a sentiment, and because I'm working with vellum, I'm using my Mini MISTI in order to add a one-word sentiment. And the one-word sentiment comes from the Holiday Village stamp set, by the way, so it is a different stamp set. And by the way, I will post a link below this video so you can go to that link to find the product list for this video. And at this point, I'm working on lining up my one-word sentiment, and in the MISTI, I did have to do a little bit of adjusting to make sure that it was actually straight, so the fact that there's an alignment grid on the MISTI does help a lot too. And I'm going to use a dye ink to stamp this on, as you'll see in the video, but later I end up redoing the vellum panel because I didn't like the way that the dye ink looked at all, and it actually kind of bled a little bit onto the vellum, so I decided to go back and heat emboss it later. And now moving on to the third card, and I'm using the large stamp again from that Christmas Rose stamp set. I'm using a piece of very, very light gray cardstock. I'm treating it with my anti-static powder tool, and then I'm going to use Versamark ink to stamp this on the front of this top folding A2 size card base. And I'm going to stamp it yet another time, learning from my mistake on the first card to make sure that it actually has gotten a complete impression. And now that I'm satisfied that it does have a good impression, I am using silver embossing powder on top of this stamp. I won't be coloring this really. I will be adding some color to it, as you'll see, but I am not using any markers or any other medium. I'm actually going to use, well, one Copic marker as it turns out, and Nuvo drops to add some details. So now that I have this heat set, I'm going to do a similar partial die cutting technique on this card as well. I'm not going to cut a second piece of paper, and this is where I show you the second way to do this and get a partial die cut result, is to just put the part of the card you want to die cut inside the two plates and let the rest hang off, so that only the part that is sandwiched between the two plates will actually die cut. And in my opinion, this did end up working a lot better than the other way. And the other way worked, but one of the pluses of doing this way is you don't end up with a partial impression from the die by leaving the entire die on the two plates, if that makes sense. And now I'm using a different method to trim this as from what I did before, because this actually ended up being a little bit easier for me. And whichever way works for you is great. I just wanted to show that there is more than one way to do something. So what I'm being very careful to do is just cut up to where the die cut is and not past that. And now I've gotten my second panel mostly prepared. Now this is the only time I use a marker on this project, and I'm using an N3 marker to add a little bit of a shadow detail around the entire stamped image. And that is just to help it stand out a little bit more against the light gray cardstock. And to me, it needed a little more separation than just from the embossing alone, but you may like it just fine the way it was without doing this step. So this is pretty much a personal preference thing, whether or not you want to do something like this or not. And to take this card from being just purely monochromatic to a wow factor, I'm adding Nuvo drops in Autumn Red to the places where all the berries are in the stamped image. And to finish it off, I stamp a sentiment onto a piece of vellum cardstock and add that in the center. Here's a final look at all three of the cards I created today. I hope that you've learned something new, or at least picked up a tip or two watching the video. If you have, please leave me a comment or a thumbs up. And if you haven't subscribed, I hope you'll take a moment to do so right now. In the meantime, I dare you to get artsy.